Welcome back to the Only Healthcare Podcast. I'm here today with Carole Tremonti, and we're going to be talking about what happened at the Clinical Pathways Congress, as well as a couple of the important sessions that occurred on Saturday regarding a particular project that Carole's been involved with. So, Carole, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Carole Tremonti. I work at ConcertAI. I am the Vice President of CancerLink and our provider partnerships. And I have worked for a very long time in oncology, over 25 years, in the clinical decision support space, specifically around treatment decision making. I began my journey in pathways when I was working at Dana-Farber, constructing their pathways program, and now have evolved into AI and how big data can really influence personalized medicine and treatment decisions for all patients. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Carole. And I'll start out just talking a little bit about the Clinical Pathways Congress, as it was an anniversary year, along with an anniversary year for the journal. Both of us are on the journal editorial board. But what were your takeaways from this year's Congress that was held in Boston?
One of my biggest takeaways was a greater engagement and a diversity of the engagement that we had. And when I mean engagement, the types of conversations that came up at the meetings, the types of questions that people were asking. And for the first time, we're very much observing multiple lanes of work coming together. So we've historically, there have been very much a focus just on pathways and decision support, but nothing is that black and white anymore. Now the business of oncology is very, very relevant, and pathways and the way they're used and the way they're viewed is also evolving and changing. And it was really nice to see all of those components coming together. It was great that there was a poster session. That was the first time that we had posters up and that you could see them. And it was really nice to see the academic side of things coming through. And the journal itself has grown tremendously in the last year, which means, the work that we're doing is really important. It is out there and people are talking about it and they're committed. We had, again, record numbers for attendance this year, which was really positive.
Yeah, I caught some of it as well, and would agree with what you're saying. Definitely seeing some growth and expansion, more integration, which is all good things. It's something that is definitely needed in the healthcare delivery system. And then on the front end, in terms of the pathways work, you've seen it from the hospital side, provider side, all the way through to the more higher level pathways that are ultimately used within managed care. What are a couple of the key changes that you've observed over the last, say, 5 years?
Yeah, the biggest change is data and workflow. It's even more important than ever. Although I will say at the same time, things have also not changed at all around data and workflow. So yes, data is critical. You can only manage what you can measure, but that only works also if people are engaging with the platform itself. So, one big thing I've seen is a workflow change where previously we were doing a lot of clicks to enter information, but now many of those clicks to get from point A to Z have become more automated, which is wonderful. And they've become more discrete, which is even better because a discrete data field is something that we can also learn from. And really, ultimately, all users of pathways are really looking to learn from populations, learn from patterns of behavior, learn from geographic differences in prescribing patterns and even in patient populations. And I'm really seeing more of a global view versus 5 years ago trying to influence individual behavior. And this to me is very powerful because then, we're talking about a system at this point, right? We're talking about the community of cancer patients and how best are we able to serve them, but really identify what is the best thing for them as individuals, not as an aggregate group. And I love that. I love that that's where we're moving into specificity.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes along with the whole effort that has evolved around whole person health, patient
Hmm.
centered care. We've been talking about for probably a couple decades already. And we seem to
Yep.
finally be making some progress there. And there certainly seems to be an opportunity to start leveraging pathways beyond the original way they evolved, as you said, more specific and get it more generalizable as well as personalized at the same time. One of the
Mm-hmm.
keynote speakers that I overheard on the first day of the conference was really dealing with artificial intelligence, where this was all headed, what was expected to happen, because all of us have our ideas around what this is going to look like. But I think, particularly for pathways, AI represents a very interesting aspect that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on. What have you been seeing?
Absolutely. I truly think this is the one hurt, pathways is the one hurt in the cancer community where AI will probably help the most, will really support us in so many ways. And what I mean by that is, to your point about being more, individualized and specific for a person, because not just by the treatment itself, but social determinants of health, being able to bring in our physical being
Mm,
and our lifestyles into treatment decision making will be highly value add. And that's just not something we've been able to do previously because we couldn't access that data, that information.
mm,
I think that's going to be hugely helpful. I think it will be, or I don't think, I know it will be easier for us to compare options for an individual patient in a more meaningful, data driven way, right? So,
mhm,
holy grail of what we would always want to do is be able to bring in comorbidities that an individual has that would have been excluded from a clinical trial, right?
mm,
That
mm, yeah,
information wouldn't have been there, but that's how we're making a treatment decision. So how can we add additional layers of information to this very important decision making process so that we are steering patients in a direction where they are going to be most successful in completing the treatment? Because it isn't just about choosing it, it's being sure somebody can stay on it for as long as possible so that it can be effective. I see AI being incredibly value there. I see AI being able to help us see trends for patients while they're on treatment more
mhm,
quickly, more visibly. So we had a lot of speakers at the conference as well talking about the different triage support or the different ways in which they're using data to help support patients while they're on their treatment selection.
mhm,
I think these are all ways where AI is really going to show us such a multi-dimensional view of a patient that we've never even been able to conceive of before. I mean,
mm,
think about if my holy grail, and I said it at the conference in our session, of how great would it be if we could see a regimen by how much money it cost, but for that individual, right? Like you and I both have two separate insurance policies. Your copay is different than
mhm,
mine. How might that come into this equation and help an individual make a decision that
mhm.
works for them, even financially? All these things matter, and all of them have a great impact on how successful someone is in their cancer treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole what we call business side of it, or the economics, certainly have to be in sync with what's happening on the clinical patient care side of the equation.
Mhm,
So that's a good
mhm,
segue into the effort that you've been involved with, along with several others in the Pathways world, around trying to really model how do we get the right cost information, and then look at ways in which, in more of a global view, uh, have that information available so that we can do these kinds of assessments and start building it into some of these different pathways and so forth, is the sense that I was getting. from what was published in the August journal. But I didn't have a chance to go to the panel that you led to have the
Mhm.
discussion on this in more detail. So, could you kind of give us an overview of what that modeling work group was all about and how
Yeah.
it led to this session and the initial publication that came out?
Yes, happy to. So this has been a long time running that we have sought to be able to provide some more, lack of a better word, data into decision making around pathways. And so I was commenting on this just a few moments ago of how great if we could look at for even an individual what cost was. And historically, that has just not been a reachable goal. Uh, but, if it's not hard, it's not worth doing. So a group of us got together who all are former pathway developers themselves and or current pathway developers or decision makers and said, we need a way to more effectively and meaningfully evaluate these agents beyond the traditional, safety, efficacy. We wanted to understand cost and to be a more cost conscious decision making group. So the holy grail, and we talked about this in the session, was to be able to understand a total cost of care for treatment, right? That's what we
Hmm.
really would love to know. However, a total cost of care is something that's retrospective. We don't know it until the money's already spent. So it makes it very difficult to really see what that's like and make a decision on it when, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know the outcomes individual A versus individual B may have on a given treatment until later. So we came together and said, well, there are a lot of knowns. We know what is going to happen to a degree when someone is on a treatment. So could we come together and establish predictable costs associated with a regimen? Because we do have a clinical trial that had a lot of patients. And so we do
Hmm.
have a good sense of what happened to those individuals on the clinical trial. And we can use that. So came this birth of the concept of let's come up with a predictable cost of care for a regimen that would be able to be submitted for consideration to any pathway developer for their committees to decide. Think about this when you're evaluating option A versus option B to be placed onto your pathway itself. Sounds totally logical. Sounds like a great plan. It is very hard. So this
Yeah.
was the second iteration of it. We had a working group about this point almost 2 years ago now, and it was the first group to come together, and we established in the first one with the first publication of what are the things that should go in to a predictable cost of care model. So even it's basically defining the parameters of the model. Do you include this or do you exclude this?
Hmm.
And that was the first work we did. Then we've spent the last year trying to build out that model, trying to build out a framework for a model that could be used and calculated across diseases, across indications, whether it was solid tumors or hemalignancies. And we've done a good job of that this year. What's been very interesting and where we ran into roadblocks is actually data access and data accessibility. It sounds it's funny that it sounds logical, yet it also is completely illogical based on how much data is available to us. What is
Sure.
not
Yeah.
readily available to us, though, is any type of norm or standard around costs, around how do you treat a specific side effect. There's so much variation in how one organization might approach something versus another organization approaching something that it's very difficult to find answers to these
Mhm.
questions. So one of the things that really bubbled up is understanding the treatment of side effects. So let me pause first and tell you what does the model look like? What is a predictable cost that we would evaluate? So we decided to actually exclude any diagnostic workup. element. So if you needed to have a biopsy, we didn't include that. We essentially assume anything that happened prior to your official diagnosis was not going to be included. What would be included is the elements that would happen to you when you are on treatment. So that means the drug costs. That could be the facility fees if it's an IV infusion, right, versus an oral agent or something to that degree. The expected side effects, the treatments that if there's pre-medications that are done routinely around every single treatment, those would be included. If there is routine monitoring that has to happen, what are those lab costs? What are any imaging that has to happen along the way? All of those we consider fitting within it. And we decided on a timeline, two timelines, one of 6 months and one of a treatment timeline of 1 year. It wasn't, we thought about doing it cycle by cycle. However, treatments are very different, and some have a very
Hmm.
intense
Yeah.
initial, 1 month, 3 month, 6 month treatment parameter, and then it changes significantly. So we wanted to be sure that we were had a long enough duration of time that it would collect that variability, be able to account for that, because some treatment regimens are very, very expensive in cycle one. Yet in cycle two and three and four and subsequent, they really trend down, where
Hmm.
others are high in cycle one and then stay the same all the way throughout. So really looking for a way in which you would be able to have parity and truly effectively compare option A costs versus option B costs if they're different.
Hmm.
Um, that was the whole parameter, sort of the bookends of the models. But really, what has been difficult is defining how much it costs to treat an individual side effect. How to do that. That is not information that is out there and easily available. So we've had to make some hard choices in that realm. We've looked at, okay, well then what guidelines for treating side effects can we reliably um, point to that everyone would agree, yes, that is a standard. So we've looked at what pharmacists' treatment patterns would be
Hmm.
for an individual treatment. How would they manage this side effect, option A, option B, option C? Because that does give you a very nice and tight framework for how to manage an individual side effect. And we talked about all of these things during the meeting, during the Clinical Pathways annual meeting, and brought up to and challenged the audience. He said, there's a couple of spaces where we need help and we need support.
Hmm.
One was, does anyone have a standard for, these side effects? Was that? Another was, does anyone want to let us use their data to try out this model? We would love to try out the model in multiple different settings to see how it applies or how it differs, or the charges that we
Hmm.
see in one space a little bit different than another space, or disease A versus disease B. Does the model work the same? Is it still coming in a space in which we can go, okay, this is something good? And then third, we had a really, really controversial question that came from the audience is, even if we create this, are people going to use it? Frankly, I don't know the answer to that just yet, but we hope.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so a couple of questions come to mind. One is, this is obviously intended for helping with treatment decisions,
Yeah.
and that has so many variables, as you pointed out, in and among itself. On the other hand, when you look at it from who is paying ultimately for this, whether it's the patient portion of the treatment, or if you're the plan sponsor, you're looking at all the diagnostics, and there's diagnostics that continue throughout the treatments. So I understand the logic on one hand to exclude pre diagnosis determination, and the
Mhm.
excluding the diagnostics, but kind of going forward, does it include the diagnostics?
Yes. Short answer is yes. It includes the way we've used the way we've created the rules engine is the only way to be fair is for people to look at the clinical trial and what happened in the clinical trial, because that is information available to everyone. So if there was routine diagnostic scans, any type of imaging, anything that
Hmm.
was part of the clinical trial for the given treatment, we include it.
Okay. So the other part I was going to ask about was going back to the side effects issue, because that is another huge variable,
It
uh,
is.
both in terms of trying to prevent the side effect, and then if you have a side effect, to treat that side effect in a way that makes sense. So you
Hmm.
have different cost patterns that can evolve with that at any cycle of treatment, depending on what you're actually trying to address therapeutically. So from the discussion with the audience in the session, were there any thoughts, or did that come up as another question that people had on the model?
It did, yeah, on, the variability and how we would be able
Mm.
to account for that. Hospital formularies or formularies in general really have a large impact here because what would could be the recommended treatment may not be available in an individual organization.
Mhm.
That's a real practical consideration that has to be taken into account. Comments around that, though, to the audience were very much, we can't be perfect. You can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And we do need to try
Mhm.
something for now. We do need to try something for now and think of that. But the side effect management is very costly. It is actually a big contributor to the overall cost of an individual treatment. Um, we did query the audience because one of the questions we were not sure about is, do you include all side effects? Do you include the expected side effects only?
Mm.
If you know a treatment is going to cause, nausea every single day, okay, great, we'll include that. But if a patient might have gone to an emergency department, for something else, does that
Mhm.
get included? And we had to say no because it's not a predictable cost of the treatment. It may be
Mm.
erratic. Now, if you need to be hospitalized to be able to support yourself on that treatment, but that's
Mhm.
planned, that we include. But we also would include the side effect management for that because it's expected. It's
Right.
predictable.
Yeah,
But if it's
that's a good
not predictable, right?
yeah, that's a good clarification, that you're focused on what we can predict. There's always unpredictableness about cancer care. But if
Yep,
we can predict to some degree of certainty, because that's what insurers and plan sponsors are looking for, is some more certainty. Yeah, there may be some
exactly.
price variables and cost variables, but if we can be more predictable, and try and focus on what we can control, that's a big help.
Mhm. Mhm,
Um,
mhm. Understanding if something is $5, 50 or 500,
mm,
that helps planning. That really helps planning. And really, one of the first things Dana Farber did when we had our Pathways program is we actually used it to help our wholesale drug ordering. We were actually able to look at what types of patients we had with certain types of indications so that we could have some sense of predictability of what we might need in the upcoming year. This is the same, very, very similar perspective of
mhm.
just helping to plan effectively for everyone to be able to plan as effectively as possible.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of supply chain considerations these days, that need to be incorporated and affect the costs. And probably for lots of members in the audience listening to this, that may not be as aware of a lot of the details as you and I may be. But we know that things are going
Hmm.
to a certain extent, get a little more simplified, but at the same time, they still remain somewhat complex, just because of the nature of what this is
Hmm.
happening. And this is beginning to evolve, not just in cancer care, but we're seeing it in some of the other treatments that are coming out, like for eczema, psoriasis, even in diabetes. So the
Hmm.
envelope is opening up more and more to look at things with a different eye, as you're suggesting. Yet this
Hmm.
work that you're doing around predictability is something that everybody's been asking for in healthcare for a long time. So it's kind of
Hmm.
interesting that it still remains a little elusive from what you seem to be saying, and the feedback from the audience. How do we get everybody on board with the same kind of thinking, at least at a baseline?
Yep. Though, it was very funny. We figured that out quickly in the first version of this group.
Hmm.
And that's why we employed a different method of doing it. The way we thought we would approach it at first didn't work out because we did need to be able to take into multiple people's opinions, but really, and perspective, but get them to a place that made sense. So we used a Delphi method, a round robin method with a lot of stakeholders to
Hmm.
continuously validate and further hone what would be included and what would not be included. It's not even would be included or not be included. It was what was really important.
Hmm.
What was always coming back to the surface at being very important to the majority of the group. Because again, we aren't going to be able to solve for every scenario, but we do have to try something. I would say that continues to be one of the more difficult aspects of this work is
Hmm.
consistently reminding people of the predictability, not total cost, but focusing on those things that we can count on happening.
Hmm.
It's we always remember the one outlier in our head that spoke the loudest, and
Yeah.
really want to bring that into a lot of our decision making, just to be sure that's not a watch out or a blind spot for someone, yet at the same time really helping people focus on what is tried and true is much more difficult than you might think.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. So the next logical question is, who do you foresee using this information and the predictability tool, this model that
Yeah.
the group is working on?
So the hope is actually twofold. The hope is that the pharmaceutical industry uses it because they are keen on having a deeper bench of evidence that they are able to be evaluated upon when they want to submit a product for an individual indication. So we're very hopeful that they use this model and that it becomes a submission for a pathway consideration. But we also hope that the healthcare organizations use this as well to think about quality, to think about patient care, to think about predictability and how they might approach their own operational costs, their own deployments to patients. We hope providers will use this with patients too, of saying, okay, here's option A, option B, just to help understand, for them to even
Mhm.
understand the framework of, well, what does that look like? Because for patients now, we're all patients. We have the receiving end of the bill. What was our copay for that day? Or, the pharmacy benefit if we need to pick something
Mhm.
up as a prescription. If we can start to merge these conversations together, I think it would be very beneficial also for our own understanding and education as a patient myself.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's where I would see this going as well. It could be very helpful because
Mhm.
patients right now have no idea until they get a bill, as you say. And this is my co-insurance, this is my co-payment or my deductible, whatever that goes along, depending on the type of coverage you may have. The other
Yes.
question is, so what's the next step? Where do you go
Mhm.
from the conversation that was held in the Boston Congress?
So what we've been doing since then, so today it's almost October, we're at the end of September at this point into fall. What we're doing is actually building the model, formally building the model, and we're validating it with a few different individuals, and then we want to test it. So we actually are going to use a real data set and calculate the predictable cost of care for a given indication, and then publish the information, publish the data out there. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't work, we're going to then need to compare it in a different disease state, see what bubbles up, what doesn't. There are currently several pharmaceutical company sponsors that are participating in this current work
Mm.
group, and many of them have stepped up and offered their organization wants to use their own data internally to test the model. And so that's our ultimate goal right now, is to get that model tested, and then we will publish out those results so we can decide, did we fail miserably and does this work need to stop? Or, what did we learn, and how do we have our own plan, do, study, act cycles of iteration of change, and what do we need to look at next? One thing that we haven't really thought about relative to pathways and
Mhm.
thinking about how we evaluate option A, option B, option C, option D is visualization. How do we visualize the data around a trial versus a flat screen that lists it? Are there different ways in which we can help clinicians to see and compare pathway regimens? I think that's something we're
Mm.
thinking about in the future for what are next steps.
Right.
Okay, let's say we do have the cost and those are available, then how do people want to digest that information?
Yeah, I would think similar to the patients themselves, the consumers of the care, but
Right.
also those insurers and plan sponsors that are paying for it. If they
Mhm.
understand what are the options and the pros and cons along with the patient, that ultimately that could be the way personalized medicine is headed to a certain extent.
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
can
Mhm.
we potentially eliminate some of the prior authorizations, because everybody knows up front what's coming up, what's potentially going to happen or could happen, and reduce some of that variance as you go forward. So even though we
Yeah,
don't
we
like to
did.
say,
Doesn't that seem? Mhm.
yeah, even though we don't always like to say treat to the average, but that's kind of what we're looking at is, okay, if we're within a certain tight range of predictability, we know there's going to be some variance, but it's not going to be that wide like it is today. That could be
Yeah.
1,000-fold difference. Uh,
Yep.
that could be very helpful to not only the consumer but to everybody else in the healthcare ecosystem, to drive
Agree.
better outcomes along with the predictable paths of care.
Mhm. And if you think about back to when pathways first came about, it came from two things: wanting to be able to be s- more specific but more predictable about what was the treatment going to
Hmm.
be for a population of patients. Prior to pathways, there was a tremendous amount of variation
Hmm.
in decision making. So great, we've won that battle, right? Like we now
Hmm.
understand there is a standard, but of course there's always room and should be room for deviation, because as you
Right.
said, playing to the averages only works part of the time. It doesn't work all of the time.
Right.
But how do we build on that though, right? How do we build on that and potentially reduce the friction in the prior authorization process? Because if pathways in whatever iteration they're in are well informed for an indication, right? You've got clinical parameters that you're able to bring in about a patient, and you've had a sensitivity to cost, and you're able to show all of that information. You know, in theory, we could see automated prior authorization. If
Hmm.
the evidence is there and it meets the threshold of what a payer is looking for, and we know this is the best interest of the patient, because we also know that if you aren't treated with the right thing first, then your outcomes are much poorer later. So if we
Hmm.
can if we can get a patient on the right thing first, then there, we won. We've informed enough and we've helped both sides, because we did this. There were 2 points to the story of, yes, decreasing variation and having predictability in the treatment that we were going to provide. But it was also an offensive strategy for payers who were beginning, 20 years ago to say, oh,
Hmm.
cancer costs are too expensive. We are going to put boundaries around what you can or should order. And that's really was another reason for pathways to come about, so that providers could speak with a voice of their so that providers could speak with a voice of evidence, saying, this is why I made this decision, this is in the best clinical interest of this patient, this is how I'm going to treat them, not may I. And
Sure. Yeah, that
hopefully,
makes
if
a
we
lot.
come to enough Yeah, if we come to enough data and we can satisfy the needs of the actual buyer, the insurance company, then we've helped move things along.
For the United States in particular, since most of our audience is in the United States, we have an
Mhm.
issue with malpractice and risk
Mhm.
management, litigation, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so in a way, this is yet another opportunity to help reduce that risk that could be out there, where you're being
Mhm.
second guessed, not only because of the cost issue, either pro or con on the cost,
Mhm.
but that there is still that level of evidence and appropriateness in terms of the care that gives you some consistency that goes along with the predictability, because those two kind of
Mhm.
go hand in hand.
Mhm. Mhm. And to me, that's exactly why pathways have been attractive for organizations to be used in health
Mm.
systems because it is supportive and evidentiary of solid decision making. Is there. We know exactly why someone made the decision they made and for what reason. And if they deviated from that, we know that too because we're documenting it. I would say these are huge wins. We didn't routinely do this a long time ago, but now we
Mm.
know. And then if you think about where things are going in the future, this is really important because now we can learn from the whys. We can learn from the patterns over time, and that will make us better as we shape and define decisions that are appropriate for different indications moving forward. Really bringing in not just what happened in the clinical trial, but bringing real world evidence in will really change the game for pathways.
Yeah, definitely. This is part of what I would view as continuous quality improvement in the
Right.
utmost sense, in terms of not just the clinical trial pieces, which could be various stages and can include real world evidence, but having that mix with real world evidence, looking at all the parameters, not just the clinical, but also the economic, really gets you that
Mhm.
opportunity to achieve clinical effectiveness within the standard of practice. So I totally
Definitely.
agree with the direction that seems to be headed. So it's going to be fun to watch this evolve over the next few months and probably several years, based on what you've been doing
Mhm.
so far. And I appreciate the time you were able to spend with us today and kind of explain what's happening in this field and the model that you've been involved in through the clinical pathways effort. And the sessions, I'm sure, will be continuing as we go forward, and you have more information to share with the audience that attends the Congress itself, and then
Mhm.
potential opportunities for future podcasts. So, with that, I'm
Great.
going to
Thanks for
close.
having me, Randy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we were able to finally get this recorded and to share it with our audience, since we have virtually the entire ecosystem represented. So there, I think everybody
Mhm.
would be able to get something out of this particular episode, which is going to be
Good.
great. And I appreciate everyone who's listening to the Only Healthcare podcast or viewing it on all the various podcast platforms. And you can always find us at onlyhealthcarepodcast.com and sign up and follow us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the Only Healthcare podcast. We hope you found today's episode insightful and informative. Remember, our mission is to provide actionable and inspirational insights on how we can improve healthcare cost, care, and accessibility for all. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and share with your friends and family. For more resources and updates, visit us at onlyhealthcarepodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. Until next time, stay informed, and together, let's navigate the journey to better healthcare.